The PlayStation is a 32-bit video game console released by Sony Computer Entertainment in Japan on December 3, 1994. The console was released in North America and Europe in September 1995. The PlayStation was the first of the PlayStation series of consoles and handheld game devices. As part of the fifth generation of gaming, it primarily competed with the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn. In 2000, a redesigned slim version called the PSone was released, replacing the original grey console and named appropriately to avoid confusion with its successor, the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation was the first computer entertainment platform to ship 100 million units, which it had reached 9 years and 6 months after its initial launch. The last PSone units were sold on Christmas 2004 before it was finally discontinued, for a total of 102 million units shipped since its launch 10 years earlier. Games continued to sell until Sony ceased production of PlayStation games on March 23, 2006, over 11 years after it was released, and less than a year before the debut of the PlayStation 3. History, development. The first conceptions of the PlayStation date back to 1986. Nintendo had been attempting to work with disc-based technology since the Famicom, but the medium had problems. The Famicom disk system's rewritable magnetic discs could be easily erased, and they lacked any sort of copy protection, thus were vulnerable to piracy. Consequently, when details of CD-ROM XA were released to the public, Nintendo was interested. Simultaneously developed by Sony and Philips, CD-ROM XA was an extension of the CD-ROM format that combines compressed audio, visual, and computer data, allowing all to be accessed simultaneously. Nintendo approached Sony to develop a CD-ROM add-on, tentatively titled the SNES CD. A contract was signed, and work began. Nintendo's choice of Sony was due to a prior dealing. Ken Kitaraji, the person who would later be dubbed the father of the PlayStation, was the individual who has sold Nintendo on using the Sony SPC700 processor for use as the 8-channel ADPCM sound set in the Super Famicom SNES console through an impressive demonstration of the processor's capabilities. Ironically, Kitaraji was nearly fired by Sony because he was originally working with Nintendo on the side without Sony's knowledge. It was then CEO, Norio Oga, who recognized the potential in Kitaraji's chip, and in working with Nintendo on the project. Oga kept Kitaraji on at Sony, and it was not until Nintendo cancelled the project that Sony decided to develop its own console. Sony also planned to develop a Super Nintendo-compatible, Sony-branded console, but one which would be more of a home entertainment system playing both Super Nintendo cartridges and a new CD format which Sony would design. This was also to be the format used in SNES CDs, giving a large degree of control to Sony despite Nintendo's leading position in the video gaming market. The product, dubbed the PlayStation, was to be announced at the May 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. However, when Nintendo's Hiroshi Yamauchi read the original 1988 contract between Sony and Nintendo, he realized that the earlier agreement essentially handed Sony complete control over any and all titles written on the SNES CD-ROM format. Yamauchi decided that the contract was totally unacceptable and he secretly cancelled all plans for the joint Nintendo-Sony SNES CD attachment. Instead of announcing a partnership between Sony and Nintendo, at 9 a.m. the day of the CES, Nintendo chairman Howard Lincoln stepped onto the stage and revealed that Nintendo was now allied with Philips, and Nintendo was planning on abandoning all the previous work Nintendo and Sony had accomplished. Lincoln and Minoru Arakawa had, unbeknownst to Sony, flown to Philips headquarters in Europe and formed an alliance of a decidedly different nature, one that would give Nintendo total control over its licenses on Philips machines. After the collapse of the joint project, Sony considered halting their research, but ultimately the company decided to use what they had developed so far and make it into a complete, standalone console. As a result, Nintendo filed a lawsuit claiming breach of contract and attempted, in U.S. federal court, to obtain an injunction against the release of what was originally christened the PlayStation, on the grounds that Nintendo owned the name. The federal judge presiding over the case denied the injunction and, In October 1991, the first incarnation of the aforementioned brand-new game system was revealed. However, it is theorized that only 200 or so of these machines were ever produced. By the end of 1992, Sony and Nintendo reached a deal whereby the PlayStation would still have a port for SNES games, but Nintendo would own the rights and receive the bulk of the profits from the games, and the SNES would continue to use the Sony-designed audio chip. However, Sony decided in early 1993 to begin reworking the PlayStation concept to target a new generation of hardware and software. As part of this process, the SNES cartridge port was dropped and the space between the names PlayStation was removed, becoming PlayStation, thereby ending Nintendo's involvement with the project. Sony's North American division, known as Sony Computer Entertainment America, originally planned to market the new console under the alternative branding PSX following the negative feedback regarding PlayStation in focus group studies. Early advertising prior to the console's launch in North America referenced PSX, but the term was scrapped before launch. The PlayStation was launched in Japan on December 3, 1994, North America on September 9, 1995, Europe on September 29, 1995, and Oceania on November 15, 1995. The launch price in the American market was $299 and Sony enjoyed a very successful launch with titles of almost every genre, including Battle Arena Toshinden, Doom, Warhawk, Air Combat, Philosoma, Ridge Racer and Rayman. Almost all of Sony's and Namco's launch titles went on to spawn numerous sequels. Critics praised the console for the quality of its three-dimensional graphics. Then Microsoft chairman, Bill Gates, preferred Sony's console to the competition from Sega, saying our game designer likes the Sony machine. Microsoft would later compete with Sony with its Xbox console. In a special Game Machine Cross review in May 1995, Famicom Zarshin would score the PlayStation console a 19 out of 40. Functionality: in addition to playing games, the PlayStation has the ability to play audio CDs. The CD player has the ability to shuffle the playback order, play the songs in a programmed order, and repeat one song or the entire disc. Later PlayStation models can utilize a music visualization function called SoundScope. This function, as well as a memory card manager, can be accessed by starting the console either without inserting a game or keeping the CD tray open, thereby accessing a GUI for the PlayStation BIOS. The actual GUI for both PSone and PlayStation differ graphically depending on firmware versions. The original PlayStation GUI had a dark blue background with rainbow graffiti used as buttons. The early PAL PlayStation and PSone GUI had a grey blocked background with two icons in the middle, different on each version. If the CD lid is closed with a game inside at any time while at the menu, the game will immediately start. Software library. As of June 30, 2007, a total of 7,918 software titles have been released worldwide. As of March 31, 2007, the cumulative software shipment was at 962 million units. The last game for the system released in the United States was FIFA Football 2005. However, several reprinted and remastered editions were released in later years. Metal Gear Solid: The Essential Collection was released on July 26, 2007, which contained Metal Gear Solid in the original PlayStation format. In 2011, Capcom released the Resident Evil 15th Anniversary Collection, and in 2012, Square Enix released the Final Fantasy 25th Anniversary Ultimate Box in Japan containing all of the Final Fantasy titles, a majority of which were in the PS1 format. Regional variants: the OK and cancel buttons on most of the Japanese PlayStation games are reversed in their North American and European releases. In Japan, the button is used as the OK button, while the button is used as cancel. North American and European releases have the button or the buttons as the OK button, while either the or the button is used as cancel. However, a few games, such as Square's Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy Tactics, Namco's Ridge Racer Type 4, and Konami's Metal Gear Solid, use the Japanese button layout worldwide. Some other games, like the Japanese version of Gran Turismo, had used different controls that are similar to North American games. These Japanese button layouts still apply to other PlayStation consoles. This is because in the early years Sony America, Sony Europe, and Sony Japan had different development and testing documents for their respective territories. Hardware problems. With the early units, particularly the early 100X models, many gamers experience skipping full-motion video or physical ticking noises coming from their PlayStation units. The problem appears to have come from poorly placed vents leading to overheating in some environments. The plastic moldings inside the console can warp very slightly and create knock-on effects with the laser assembly. The solution is to ensure that the console sits on a surface which dissipates heat efficiently in a well-vented area, or raise the unit up slightly from its resting surface. The first batch of PlayStations used a KSM 440 AAM laser unit whose case and all movable parts were completely made out of plastic. Over time, friction causes the plastic lens sled rail to wear out, usually unevenly. The placement of the laser unit close to the power supply accelerated wear because of the additional heat, which makes the plastic even more vulnerable to friction. Eventually, one side of the lens sled can become so worn that the laser can tilt, no longer pointing directly at the CD. This would cause data read errors and games would no longer load. One common fix is to turn the PlayStation upside down, making the lens sled rest on the unworn top rails. Sony eventually fixed the problem by making the sled tails out of die-cast metal and placing the laser unit slightly farther away from the power supply on later models of the PlayStation. Copy protection. Prior to the PlayStation, the reproduction of copyrighted material for gaming consoles was restricted to either enthusiasts with exceptional technical ability, or others that had access to CD manufacturers. However, the increased availability of cheap CD burners at this time led Sony to introduce a special wobble pressed into PlayStation formatted discs. As a result, any discs that did not contain the wobble, such as CD copies or standard pirated discs, could not boot on the console. The installation of a mod chip allowed the PlayStation to play games recorded on a regular CD-R. It also allowed the console's capabilities to be expanded in other ways, such as playing games from other regions. By the end of the system's life cycle, almost anyone with minimal soldering experience was able to perform these modifications. This created a wave of games developed without official approval using free, unofficial tools, as well as the reproduction of original discs. With the introduction of such devices, the console became very attractive to programmers and illegal copiers alike, as well as those who merely wished to protect the lifespan of their lawful, original discs. Some companies did manage to produce discs that booted on unmodified retail units while using special equipment. Models. The PlayStation went through a number of variants during its production run. From an external perspective, the most notable change between variants was the reduction in the number of connectors. The RCA jacks were removed in the first revision, and the parallel I/O port was removed in the final revision. On July 7, 2000, Sony released the PSone, a smaller, redesigned version of the original PlayStation. It was the highest-selling console through the end of the year, even outselling its successor, the PlayStation 2, which debuted a few months earlier. A version of the PSone included a 5-inch LCD screen, referred to as the Combo Pack. In 1997, Sony marketed a development kit for hobbyists also known as the Net Euros. The development console came with the necessary documentation and software to program PlayStation games and applications. Technical specifications. Successors. Sony's successor to the PlayStation is the PlayStation 2, which is backwards compatible with its predecessor in that it can play almost every PlayStation game. The third generation of the PlayStation, the PlayStation 3, was launched on November 11, 2006 in Japan, November 17, 2006 in North America, and March 23, 2007 in Europe. Like the PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 3 is able to play most original PlayStation games. While PlayStation 3 games are not region-locked, PlayStation and PlayStation 2 games are only playable on PlayStation 3 consoles from the same region. A third successor, the PlayStation 4, was announced by Sony on February 20, 2013 and was released in the US on November 15, Europe was November 29, 2013 and Japan and Asia in February 22, 2014. However, it is not backwards compatible with any of the earlier consoles. The PlayStation Portable, or PSP, is a handheld game console first released in late 2004. The PSP is capable of playing PlayStation games downloaded via Sony's online store, and can also play any PlayStation game by using the PlayStation 3's Remote Play feature while the disc is in the PlayStation 3. Sony hopes to release nearly all PlayStation games on a gradual basis. It is also possible to convert original PlayStation disc images into executable binaries using freely available software. These games are then playable on PSPs that have been modified to run unsigned code. The successor to the PSP, the PlayStation Vita, was introduced as a part of the 8th generation of video game consoles, and was backwards compatible with original PlayStation Portable as well as PS1 games via download. Legacy: Sony Computer Entertainment was an upstart in the video game industry in 1994, as the early 1990s were dominated by Nintendo and Sega. Nintendo had been the clear leader in the video game industry since the introduction of the NES in 1985, and the Nintendo 64 was initially expected to maintain this position for Nintendo. Sony focused on a broader base of audiences including adults, and marketed the PlayStation for newcomers and an older age group but ignored the younger audience below 15 who were perceived to be staunch in their loyalty to Nintendo and Sega. By the late 1990s, Sony became a highly regarded console brand due to the PlayStation, with a significant lead over second-place Nintendo while Sega was relegated to a distant third. The PlayStation's lead in installed base and developer support paved the way for the success of the next-generation PlayStation 2, which overcame an early launch from the Sega Dreamcast and then fended off competition from the Microsoft Xbox and Nintendo GameCube. CD format: the success of the PlayStation is widely believed to have influenced the demise of the cartridge-based home console. While not the first system to utilize an optical disc format, it was the first success story, and ended up going head-to-head with the last major home console to rely on proprietary cartridge gears, the Nintendo 64. Nintendo was very public about its skepticism toward using CDs and DVDs to store games, citing longer load times and durability issues. It was widely speculated that the company was even more concerned with the proprietary cartridge format's ability to help enforce copy protection, given its substantial reliance on licensing and exclusive titles for its revenue. Piracy was rampant on the PlayStation due to the relative ease of the installation of a mod chip, allowing the PlayStation to play games region-free and/or recorded on a regular CDR, making the console very attractive to programmers and illegal copiers alike. The increasing complexity of games pushed cartridges to their storage limits, and this gradually turned off some third-party developers. Part of the CD format's appeal to publishers was due to the fact that they could be produced at a significantly lower cost and offered more production flexibility to meet demand. As a result, some third-party developers switched to the PlayStation, such as Squaresoft, whose Final Fantasy VII, and Enix, whose Dragon Quest VII titles were initially pre-planned for the N64. While some who remained released fewer games to the Nintendo 64. While new games were coming out rapidly for the PlayStation, new Nintendo 64 game releases were infrequent, and that system's biggest successes were developed by either Nintendo itself or by second parties of Nintendo, such as Rare. See also: libcrypt, list of PlayStation games, chronology of PlayStation games, PlayStation demo discs, PlayStation Palma Hydrodenitis, PlayStation sound format, Runix, references.